Angela Merkel firmly insists that inviting hundreds of thousands of people to Europe was a good move. It's a process, but we've achieved a lot so far, and what remains to be done must be continued. Chancellor Merkel said so in 2015, while opening the doors to Europe. Paradoxically, a simple consequence of opening these borders was the closure of the German-Polish border. The current German chancellor has announced an extension of the border controls introduced in 2023. How is this possible, given that, according to the Schengen Agreement, such controls can only be introduced for a maximum of 2 years? The very idea of introducing controls is a contradiction of one of the pillars of the European Union, namely the free movement of people. This law regulates and describes these things. The 2016 Border Code did not provide for the possibility of permanent border controls at all. The regulations are so vague that Germany is extending the closure of its borders without hindrance. With a good application and proper use of these regulations, these controls can in fact be applied non-stop. Friedrich Merz also announced cuts in spending on medical treatment, social care, and benefits for immigrants. The Bundestag's policy is consistent, and the German economy is not in the best shape, which is why it is easier for Merz to deal with migrants. The welfare state that we have today can no longer be financed with what we produce in the economy, Merz said. Only in the field of migration and migration policy can Friedrich Merz show himself to be a strong, effective chancellor, and he really needs that. The only thing the chancellor can do now is continue the policy of deportations, which also affects Poland. As part of the so-called rejection procedure, Germany sends unwanted migrants to neighboring countries, which is made much easier by the controls introduced 2 years ago. According to official Bundestag data, several thousand immigrants have already been transferred to Poland alone. What does the Polish government say about this?
Zaczynamy ten wielki wysiłek. Bardzo proszę o wsparcie wszystkich dla Straży Granicznej, dla policji, dla wojska, dla wszystkich służb, które na naszych granicach zaczynają tę trudną pracę.
However, data presented today by the head of the border guard show that the Polish side is much less effective. In sum, on both borders, we rejected 343 foreigners. On the border with Germany, 200 people, and on the border with Lithuania, 143 people. This concerns the period from July 7th to August 24th. According to the German police, in the period from July 7th to August 5th, i.e. 3 weeks shorter, Germany rejected 360 people to Poland under the rejection procedure, about 3 times more. Between July 7th and August 5th, German police deported 360 people to Poland under the rejection procedure. The participants of citizen patrols, including the Border Defense Movement, know very well why the results of Polish checks are what they are. Volunteers from the Border Defense Movement and ordinary citizens report that Polish border controls are very selective, even fictitious. This is very disturbing. The effectiveness of these checks may not be spectacular, but the very fact that such checks are in place and that citizen patrols are active certainly hinders German ambitions to solve their migrant problem. But is this enough? The only effective response to the current situation in Europe, i.e. the excess of illegal immigrants who are coming to us, is simply effective deportations of migrants to their countries of origin, which in Europe amounted to 16%. The governments of Germany, Poland, and most Western countries, where political correctness and wishful thinking prevail, claim that the increase in the number of immigrants is not related to the increase in crime and welfare spending, and do not want to admit that mass deportations are the only solution to mass immigration.
Barbaric shelling of civilians is just one form of Russian aggression. The Kremlin also attacks and provokes along the border with Poland. Putin's troops and supporters are also conducting aggressive hybrid operations. It is here, in the Kaliningrad region, just 25 kilometers from the Polish border, near Cherniakhovsk, a gigantic military espionage facility is being built. Previously, underground missile launchers were deployed in this city. The Russian military infrastructure is definitely geared towards spying on NATO countries and spying on Poland. In this case, we cannot assume any other scenario than that the Russians will simply do everything they can to penetrate NATO territory or carry out various provocations. We simply have to be prepared for the worst. Satellite photos show that work on the spy antenna began as early as 2023. At that time, there was bare ground there, and today the facility is almost complete. It was built in a strategic location, probably to conduct radio monitoring of NATO communications, for example. If the installation reaches operational level, that is, begins to function, it will pose a serious threat to any NATO maneuvers. NATO will lose the ability to keep situations secret, such as when conducting covert operations. The Russians will be able to listen in on NATO communications and will also be able to influence those communications. In fact, they are already influencing GPS signals, and we know that this is happening from the Kaliningrad region. 6 concentric rings with a diameter of over 1.5 kilometers have already been built. There are places for antenna masts, there is military infrastructure, and radar equipment is being installed. These Kremlin ears can not only listen to what is happening in the region, but also cause chaos to NATO communications. This allows you to understand the enemy's moves, meaning that information is a weapon, and this weapon is one of the key ones on the modern battlefield. It is no coincidence that from the very first day of the war in Ukraine, the Russians attacked not only civilians but also Ukrainian radars, military antennas and other strategic communications equipment. Without adequate communications and intelligence, it is impossible to operate effectively on the battlefield today. In fact, today, apart from kinetic conflict involving bombs and killing people, war is also being waged in the sphere of communications. No army without accurate communications is able to achieve readiness or achieve the objectives set by its staff. What Russia is launching in the Kaliningrad region poses a very serious threat to our region. And all this is happening right on our border. The Kaliningrad Oblast is a repository of Russian weapons and military systems. Soldiers are deployed here, maneuvers are organized, and Russian warships are moored here. Russian provocateurs want to be as close to NATO's borders as possible.
Russia has really showed no indication that it wants to stop this war once it acquires Donetsk and Luhansk. If this were the case, it wouldn't have launched its 2022 invasion. Really, as in the last 10 years, or especially since 2013-14, as we've seen increasing westward integration in Ukraine, and that is only, I guess, fired up, if you will, Russia's desire.
One of these is a military spy antenna right on NATO's eastern flank. Russia is escalating once again and has been doing so continuously for 2 years now. It is escalating various types of preparations, various types of infrastructure activities, troop relocations, weapon relocations, and also the relocations of nuclear weapons to Belarus. This is also a whole series of events that are hostile in nature. Putin is waging a large-scale hybrid war, especially in our region. The Russian threat must not be underestimated. Yachts, sunbeds and fancy coffee machines. Some European companies seem to be getting some nice perks. This is how the media in Western Europe described the scandal surrounding the distribution of Poland's money from the EU Post-COVID Recovery Fund. In its report, the German-French editorial team at ARTE discusses companies and projects receiving funds that have nothing to do with economic development. At the beginning of August, the Polish government published a map showing who received the money. After a quick search, internet users discovered that companies had spent around €280 million on saunas, sunbeds, yachts and other luxury items, all under the guise of diversifying activities to protect against future crises. Irregularities and abuses have also been revealed in other countries, but the ARTE journalists emphasized the enormous scale of the pathology in Poland under Donald Tusk's government. In Poland, Donald Tusk's government is in chaos after a similar scandal. Tens of billions of euros from European funds that had been frozen under the previous government have been released. The scandal over Poland's EU Recovery Fund money, also called the KPO scandal, is also being covered by other European media outlets, including the Daily Telegraph, Politico and Bloomberg. This dispute is another blow to Tusk, the former president of the European Council. who managed to unblock the funds after winning the 2023 election when he promised to restore democratic order in Poland. The previous government, in which Kaczynski served twice as deputy prime minister, lost access to tens of billions of euros in financial aid after EU courts ruled that judicial reforms gave politicians too much influence over judges in violation of EU rule of law standards. And yet the opposition warned from the outset that the money from the National Recovery Plan was nothing more than a financial instrument of political pressure on Poland. Every time, we have already learned, it ends with those who are not obedient being punished and blackmailed. Tusk's government announced audits, but the list of companies to be checked did not include those linked to politicians from the civic platform, Tusk's party, whose subsidies caused the most controversy. The case is being investigated by the European Public Prosecutor's Office, among others, and politicians from Tusk's coalition government seem to have realized that the KPU scandal cannot simply be swept under the carpet. I am convinced that all the information that has appeared in the media will be clarified and that every zloty that may have been spent in a manner inconsistent with the procedures will be returned to the Polish budget. However, the damage has already been done. All of Europe has already heard about how Tusk's Poland is using European Union taxpayers' money. The Polish model of spending this money has become a symbol of all of the EU's pathology and has therefore been propagated within the European Union as the worst example of said pathology. These huge sums of money were supposed to strengthen the economies of EU member states after the crisis caused by the lockdowns imposed by the almost all European governments during the COVID-19 pandemic. But in Poland, instead of going to companies that actually suffered during that period, funds very often ended up in the accounts of companies linked to politicians from Tusk's coalition. Poland is shown among countries like Italy, Greece and Slovakia, which are considered to be extremely corrupt. This could mean that Poland will receive less EU funding in future. What Germany naturally regrets is its contribution to the overall European Recovery Fund programme. According to the Germans, as the economy that contributes the most to the European budget, it received much less than it contributed. This is bad news for Poland, but even worse news for Donald Tusk. What is particularly painful for Tusk is that the Germans are writing about it. As we know, it was thanks to Germany and the support of Brussels that he became prime minister. External pressure regarding the recovery fund largely convinced Poles to vote for Tusk. Today he is losing face because he is misusing the recovery funds. This, in my opinion, is a very dangerous situation for Tusk because he already has no support in the United States. If he loses his support in Berlin and Brussels, it will be the end of his political career. The latest United Surveys poll shows that almost 7 out of 10 Poles are demanding the resignation of Katarzyna Polczyńska-Nałęcz, Minister of Funds and Regional Policy, who is directly responsible for distributing money from the EU Recovery Fund, including the money that went on yachts, sunbeds and fancy coffee machines.
The situation in the Middle East is escalating. A powerful explosion rocked the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, following another attempted attack by Houthi militants on Israel. Bombs fell in the area of the presidential palace and weapons and fuel depots. Tel Aviv threatened further bombing if the Houthis continued to try to attack Israel. Whoever attacks us will be attacked. Whoever plans to attack us will also be attacked. I think the whole region is learning about Israel's strength and determination. The attacks by Yemeni militants are directly related to the start of the Israeli offensive on Gaza. The Houthis support Palestine and work closely with Hamas. In addition, they have explicitly announced an expansion of the naval blockade. This phase involves attacking all ships belonging to any company that deals with the ports of the Israeli enemy, regardless of the nationality of the company and anywhere within the reach of the armed forces. This declaration is not so much a threat to Israel as it is to all of Israel's partners, as has already been noted in the United States, among other places. The Americans have repeatedly warned Yemen against attacking commercial ships and have directly threatened to bomb militant bases and mosques. We are continuing to impose an air and sea blockade and are attacking infrastructure targets that are used to support Houthi terrorism. For every rocket they fire at Israel, the Houthis will pay dearly. Today we have brought the plague of darkness upon the Houthis, and later the plague of death of the firstborn will also come. At the same time, Israel is under increasing international pressure. The UN is openly calling for a halt to the offensive on Gaza.
And talking about peace, I must reiterate that it is vital to reach immediately a ceasefire in Gaza and the unconditional release of all hostages, and to avoid the massive deaths and destruction that a military operation against Gaza City would inevitably cause.
The problem is that Hamas does not want to release all Israeli hostages, which was a condition for negotiations with Tel Aviv. Today, Netanyahu's government has no intention of negotiating further. In turn, Israel is accused of blocking humanitarian aid to Gaza and striking alleged Hamas camps, despite the presence of civilians in these areas. According to Western agencies, bombs fell on a hospital, among other places, during today's shelling of Gaza. According to Western media, 20 people were killed on the spot, including 5 journalists from Reuters and AP, among others. Israel officially confirmed and apologized for the shelling, while announcing that it was conducting an internal investigation.